Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and I'm finally presenting you guys my review of Star Wars, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Taking me a while to finish it, but guess what? I'm pretty much reading a history book. It is actually written by a real-life historian, Dr. Chris Kempshall, and there's a blurb in the back, which I did read about. So he's a World War I historian, and he's also written about the way history has been presented in fictional properties before, namely video games. But this is not the first Star Wars book. No, he also contributed to Star Wars Battles That Changed the Galaxy, which I'm pretty sure I do have, but I don't have it with me right now. But this is a really good read. Now, for context, the story is, or the book I should say, was actually by Dr. Chris Kempshall. Is actually presented as if it was being written by Beaumont Kin. So he's that person in The Rise of Skywalker who, after when Poe said somehow the Sith returned, or somehow Palpatine returned, which, by the way, why would Poe know how? He's not in the know. And we are shown how. But Beaumont Kin's the one who speculates cloning, dark science, secrets that only the Sith knew. He's that character. And that character's background knows that he was a historian, and after the Hazian Cataclysm, he decided he was going to join the resistance rather than sit on and do nothing like all his fellow academics where he was teaching war. So that's the context for this book. That's the context. It's like a real-life historical context. And it is great. You probably caught my video I did last week and the week before. Technically, last week was the nice visual version, while the previous week was the actual fun version. Why We Fight Rebel Alliance PSA I did as a live sketch with some of my friends. This was in part my inspiration for that book, for that video, that presentation. This was part of my inspiration. The idea of present this from the in-universe perspective, but still provide a real life, not necessarily lessons, or this certainly does, but make it I'm telling you the lore from an in-universe perspective, and that's what this is. This is a canon lore book. It's not like those reference guides. This is no reference guide. This is 100% canon in the universe. And there's just things that, before I even get into the meat and bone of it, it's they take pictures from the TV shows, movies, and all that. Actually, I don't know if they have anything from Rebels or any of the animated properties. Don't remember seeing that. But Rise of Skywalker, all that. They got stuff from video games taken in here. The Mandalorian, Rogue One. Literally, the only thing I think it's missing is I don't believe they showed a single picture from the animated stuff, which makes sense. It does make sense. So they do get kind of close in some areas, just because there's one, I forget exactly where, but they basically, okay, right here. That picture is labeled as from Sky Strike Academy, which we saw in Rebels. But that's not from Rebels. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's from Star Wars Squadrons where that picture is taken from. Just several ways of captioning these pictures to justify their inclusions, even though they were taken were taken from the film rather than from the actual universe. I love the use of citations on the bottom, pretty much not quite Chicago style, but Dr. Kempshall, he's based out of the UK, so I don't think they use Chicago style over there. But footnotes, I love footnotes. They're the best way to cite your sources, and I stand by it. And I really love the structure of this book. It's it's a report and all that, but it's really a universe history novel, pretty much. There is actually a book about World War II, The Rise and Fall of, The Rise and Fall of Nazi Germany, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, something like that, but same concept is how this one was written. You got rising consolidation, all the different chapters, expansion and oppression, Galactic Civil War, fall and continuation. There is so much good stuff in here. One thing I really liked about all this is it dealt with Palpatine coming back in a much more unique way than the film did. The film Rise of Skywalker, it's fun, it's enjoyable, but it's certainly no masterpiece. Same thing with the prequels. They're not masterpieces. They're supported by the secondary works. And this is that secondary work. But you get it, like, the way this is presented is that whether Palpatine returned or not is kind of a moot point. The point is that the Imperial ideology returned, and that was a problem. That's something that the Resistance, that the New Republic in this new form after defeating the First Order and the Sith Internal, are going to have to deal with to prevent a third rise of the Imperial ideology. And how they gotta make sure they don't fail those that they indoctrinated and all that. And that is very neat. Now that was mostly done in the, well, not the epilogue per se, because this book doesn't have an epilogue, but in the conclusion, and which is also presented as a reflection by Beaumont Kin in why he wrote this, dealing with having fought in the war, having to deal with the trauma and the struggles from all that, which I thought was so neat. And by the way, there's an actual index in here too, just further driving home that this is a in-universe non-fiction book, even though it's totally fiction for us. But also too, when you read this book, I also seriously read the acknowledgments at the end, because this is Dr. Chris Kempshall's words. All of this is his words, of course, but I would say there's always a lot of times acknowledgments in that, but this one I saw was probably one of the best ones because it has more of a reflection on why he wrote this, not just because he's a Star Wars fan, but he's a Star Wars fan and he's a history nerd, and this is something he's been wanting to do, write a Star Wars history book, and that's what he did. Not a reference guide, but an actual history book. And I just loved it so much. Like I said, should I break down this book in the terms of how it laid out the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire? Most certainly I probably should. But I won't. Because you should be reading this for yourself. In my opinion, anyone who is very much interested in reading about authoritarianism and tyranny, you should read this book. Yes, it's all fictional examples in this book, but it speaks to the real world. I mean, it was written by a real life historian for crying out loud. It's kind of like Andor. It's a book of a student of history, and it shows. It really does show. You get a sense of how authoritarian regimes come to power, how they make people complacent or complicit with their rule, through false promises, through threats of force, through providing just enough so that way people don't have the pressure necessary to revolt, but how when you push too far, they will revolt. Anyone who's seriously important authoritarianism, besides things like On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder, that's the one I thought of off the top of my head, and there's several others, but this should be included. Yes, it may say Star Wars, it may be talking about a fictional empire, but I do wonder if there's some people who, if they read a fictional understanding, they will become much more able to identify it happening in real life. Because after all, real life, sometimes you don't want to confront the hard stuff. Sometimes you want to bury your head in the sand to stay safe. But you're reading through here and like, wait, that's reminding me of something. Just might get you to think. Of course, there's always going to be the problem of people who actually like that stuff, and that is a reality in real life, and it's a reality that is addressed in this book for in the universe of Star Wars, especially near the conclusion about, actually one thing I mentioned in the last chapter was talking about the Sith Internal and the last fight against Palpatine, was that the older generation of First Order officers were the first ones to side with Palpatine, while the younger generation just ended up following the marching orders, but they didn't really feel a loyalty to Palpatine, but did to the ideology, which is kind of dangerous, because that's dangerous in real life. Because if you're loyal to the ideology, you cut out the figurehead, the ideological marching soldiers will continue going on. But one thing I really did like is that even though like the pictures I mentioned earlier were drawn from from mostly the live action movies and shows and the photorealistic video games, and I think a few other sources that to portray more realistic stuff to fit the theme of the book and a real aesthetic rather than a more cartoony aesthetic that we often get in animation. But it does reference the animated shows. It references the Phoenix Zone and Ghost Squadron. The last chapter references Star Wars Resistance. And of course, the only character from Star Wars Resistance they actually mention is Emmanuel Doza, the leader, the commander, captain of the Colossus, which I think is so fun. I mentioned that he was there. So we already knew that two people from Resistance were in the Battle of Exegol. Now we know there's a third. So it sounds like maybe the entire Colossus might have showed up. Not that we saw it. But this book is just so good. I know it took me a long time to read, but that's because I was reading it. I was reading it. I was doing a close read. Should I've probably done a bunch of bookmarks and all that and done a paper on this? Probably should so. I was also busy reading other things because, I also read history books in my time, so I back and forth. But really, I can't say it enough. This is a really good read. Anyone who's a Star Wars nerd and a history nerd should read this book. Anyone who cares about fighting authoritarianism and tyranny and understanding how that stuff works should read this. In the acknowledgments, Dr. Kempshall mentions, the people at Lucasfilm that helped him, but also his academic peers who also helped him, who tolerate him asking really specific questions about tiny things that he could use for this book, but without the context of why he was asking for it. I just loved that. Again, I could go on and on, talking about the logistics of the Empire too. This is so far the comprehensive Star Wars lore book, for lack of a better term, history book. And I want to read it again, of course. I want to, honestly, I just want to read it again. I would love similar books like this to be done in the future. Obviously, I feel like maybe something like High Republic theme, because after all, this pretty much covers the saga, the Skywalker saga. There's not too much way to get around that. You could do something like the Rebel Alliance, and I think that would definitely be neat. But you couldn't do this style. But I would love, whether it's treading on an area that we already done before or not, I don't care. I want more books like this. Star Wars books written by Star Wars academic nerds, basically. I would love if theology professor wrote a book about the Jedi Order. I think that'd be a really interesting and neat read. I would love an economist to tackle the Star Wars economy, which is such a mess as this. A linguist, other historians. I would love more books like this. This is what I love reading. So actually, as it turns out, since my recording my review and right before I started editing all this, it was announced that Dr. Chris Kempshall is writing another Star Wars book called Star Pilots, A History of Space Combat. And from what it sounds like, it's going to be another Star Wars history book, in-universe lore, in-universe history, written from the in-universe perspective. And it sounds like Wedge Antilles may be one of those characters being the focal point for this book. And it very much does sound like there might be, excerpts almost from other Rebel Alliance pilots reflecting on their experience about starfighter piloting history and things like that. So it sounds very interesting, and this is exactly what I was talking about. I want more books like this, in-universe history books presented in that manner. But let's go back to whatever I was saying beforehand. I loved it in real life. I love it in Star Wars. I want more of this stuff together. Now, is this my absolute favorite Star Wars book? I'm not sure. I don't know if I could actually rank them at all. Is it one of my tops? Certainly. And I just loved it from a history perspective. I now need to pick up Mask of Fear and read that, but I got another book I'm going to read before I get to that for Star Wars. But I'm a bit behind, as you can see. But really, this, like I said, was good. I certainly enjoyed it. I loved them tackling that. It also addressed other things too, not just the Empire, but also the Rebel Alliance and how it contributes, but also criminal syndicates like Crimson Dawn. It tackles the military aspect, the cultural, economic, ideological. It tackles so many different aspects. The racism or speciesism of the Empire is tackled in here. Palpatine is tackled, of course, and I loved how it's basically how they describe Palpatine succinctly as basically a vindictive, egotistical man. And you know what? That fits Palpatine to a T. And if you can think of anyone else in real life that fits that description as well, yeah, you probably should not support them. I'm just saying. Not naming any names, of course. But no, seriously, this is a really good read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And because it's literally just the history of the Empire, can't really do a plot summary. But, like I said, there's so much good stuff in here. Honestly, I feel like, 10 years ago when I was starting watching stuff on YouTube and all that, Star Wars channels were mostly doing low. This book would have been a gold mine back then. Now, with the exception of a few like Generation Tech, Star Wars Explained, and also, Cody's Datapad, which mostly does Legends though, doesn't seem like many channels do lore anymore. Reviews, of course, you also get all those grifters and that, and rage baiters, but lore, except for a few channels, have largely faded. But this would have been a gold mine back in the golden age of Star Wars lore videos. And I'm kind of surprised no channel has tackling canon lore after this book has emerged. There might have been one and I may not have popped in my feed, but it's definitely something I've observed and noted. But that's all my thoughts on the Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, and honestly it's more of my thoughts about the book and its place in the media ecosphere rather than the contents itself. Even though the contents are great, give them a read. And that's ultimately the point of this video. I want to tell you, read this book for yourself and draw your own conclusions, which you should about history. You read your history books, by properly researched history books. Yes, there's some great online resources for history, some great YouTube channels that do some good pop history, but it's not the same as a well-researched history book. Read your Star Wars history, read your real-life history, and I think we'll get someplace better in society. And also good documentaries help too, but you gotta supplement that all with reading the actual sources, whether it be the secondary sources or the primary sources. And you know what the primary sources for Star Wars are? The movies, the films, the TV shows, so watch them. And for real life, well, newspapers, diaries, journals, photographs, all that stuff are the primary sources and are very important, in fact more important than the secondary sources. But sadly, sometimes the secondary sources are the only remnant of certain primary sources that are lost to time, which is frustrating from a historical perspective. But I love referencing in-universe primary sources in this book, which is just a cherry on top. But let me know your thoughts on all this in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching my video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give this video a like and share. Also, consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on all my latest content. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and as always, have a good day, a good night, wherever you are. May the Force be with you, always.